So let's start with 30 questions
Yeah, I
arising
have a
out of.
question.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Shanti Deva, if I understand correctly, focuses on, really going into the forest, cutting off from the world. So that is the, he thinks that's important to do. And there is also this other thing that I have read about 3 levels of compassion, not from Shanti Deva, but some other talk, where, the lowest form of compassion is that to the sentient beings around us. Then the second one is the compounded phenomenon, compassion for compounded phenomenon, and not the, the stick and not the person, so to speak. And the third one is like objectless compassion, which I am assuming is about emptiness. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the Bodhisattva? How is Shanti Deva advocating for practice of Bodhisattva if one is going to be cut off from the world? And at the same time, he also says in his book that, sentient beings are important because they are also a pathway to Buddhahood and all that. He says it later on. So what is the Bodhisattva practice that a person like he would advocate, given that he encourages going off in the forest and cutting off from the world? And then this sort of 3 levels of compassion that I've read about, how does it fit in with how he is talking about it? Yeah.
Okay. So taking the first point of renunciation, I think there are 2 aspects to this. The first is we must not forget that he was actually, you remember the context in which he gave the teaching. It was immediately to the 500 monks of Nalanda. So in those days, and even at the time of the Buddha, the practice was a lot of asceticism, getting, as you said, going into the jungle, forest, renouncing physically, giving up clothes and jewelry and everything. Now, when he talks, so that's at one level. So, okay, if you're a monk, then you do renunciation that way. Even they didn't go off in the forest. They were in a university, which for those days had good facilities, library, books, rooms in which to study, practice of debate, and puja and rituals and everything, sadhanas. So when you look at any sort of treatise or any, like even the stages of the path, what is called Lamrim in Tibetan, which is like a 3-volume thing written by Tsongkhapa, they have these 3 stages: renunciation, compassion, and wisdom. Now, in those treatises, renunciation is not the same thing for everybody. It's not so much physically renouncing and physically giving up things. It's more renouncing of the attachments that we have to these things usually, and around which our whole life usually revolves. So it is not so much a physical renunciation all the time, because for householders who are married, who have family, now how can I say to someone who is married with children, growing children, now you renounce everything? No teacher would. I mean, it doesn't make sense, except in very special cases. I mean, the Buddha left home. Now no teacher would advise all men to just desert their wives and leave home and say that is renunciation. That's not. So it's more a mental attitude of not being overly attached. And in fact, there is another concept, another sort of way of looking at it, is to say, don't be troubled by the 8 worldly winds. So the 8 worldly winds are like having wealth and being poor, having fame and being defamed, and so on. So they say that real equanimity is when you are not swayed this way or that way by this 8 winds. So that is the sort of renunciation we are looking at when we come to people like us. It's not so much like, if I don't get this job, my life is over. If I don't marry this woman, my life is finished. So it's that which you have to renounce, the attachment, not that, oh, I've got a nice laptop, I must now renounce it, so I have to just give it away to some school child in Beer. No, the laptop is damn useful, but I don't have to get so attached to it that my life gets destroyed, if it scratches, there's a scratch on it. So in that sense, there is a sort of a renunciation. And in fact, I tell you a little joke about the 8 winds, just to lighten things. So there are these 2 Zen monks living across the river. And the only way you get across is by hiring a boat. So one is a very young monk, but he is more famous and more of a celebrity because of his wisdom and knowledge and manner of speaking than the old one who thinks he should be venerated that way. And this young upstart is just taking all the praise and all the fun. So this fellow, the old monk, to impress the young fellow, writes a poem. Something like, I sit on the purple blue mountain with something, something, and the clouds over me. The 8 winds blow, but they do not move me. And then he writes that and some more stuff and sends it across the river with his servant. Give it to that fellow. Let him read it and tell him I have requested. He can just make a few comments and send it back with you. So that younger fellow reads his poem and whatever commentary that fellow wrote on the poem. And he writes on the cover, the whole thing is just one big fart, and says, go and give it to your master. So the servant goes and gives it back to the monk. That guy is now furious. Now he's put all his life into this verse, and now this guy is saying, you're just farting away, just nonsense you have written. So he says, okay, you tell the boatman, tomorrow I am going to go across and challenge this fellow to a debate. How can he write such things about my work? Sorry, I can't hear you. You're muted.
The guy who wrote the poem is the older monk.
Yeah, I think, or whatever, the guy who was jealous of the fellow who is smart, all the time smart. So
Okay.
I'm calling them old and young so that, when I can tell the story easily. So the old fellow who has written the poem and who is now insulted by the comments of this thing, the more famous guy, tells his boatman, tells his attendant, you call the boatman, I am going across the river tomorrow. So when he goes next day, he finds that fellow's house locked. The door is closed and there is a lock outside. And he has put a note over there. Not just a note which says, the 8 winds do not move him, but one fart blows him across the river. So because I use these 8 winds, so that's the part of renunciation. Then they say, okay, the next thing is to develop compassion, and of course, compassion and wisdom. So you got it more or less right, but I think there is a little, first let me talk about generosity before we come to compassion, because generosity is one of the first paramitas. So when you want to express a generosity towards others, they say there are 3 types of gifts you can give. One is physical things, like somebody doesn't have clothes, you give clothes, or money for food, and so on. So physical, material goods you give to the person who is the object of your generosity. The second, they say, is to give confidence and give fearlessness, remove fear, So there are all these mudras, in the poses of the Buddha and various images of the Buddha, giving fearlessness. And the highest gift, they say, you can give somebody is the gift of dharma. And in this, even in Shantideva, you'll see in the next few verses that to remove the ignorance and confusion which leads to suffering of other sentient beings, the gift of dharma is the highest gift you could possibly give. Now, if you sort of align these 3 with compassion, Then you see what you said, the third one, the highest is emptiness, in the sense that if the ignorance about the ultimate reality of all phenomena, including your own self, is that you don't inherently exist and phenomena don't inherently exist, dispelling that ignorance and giving the person who is suffering that wisdom of emptiness of inherent existence is the highest form of dharma as well as compassion, therefore. Then what were the other first two that you said? One, and first level of compassion is to sentient beings.
Towards sentient beings, and the second one is compounded phenomenon. So not the person, but the stick, something like that.
So actually the compounded phenomena thing comes in the third one, what I already said, that you dispel the ignorance that things exist by themselves by giving the knowledge and wisdom that they are compounded phenomena to the sentient beings. Now the first one, to sentient beings, is when, they use arguments like all sentient beings are your mothers. Now, if you believe in rebirth and you had millions of rebirths and there are a finite number of people, I mean, you could sort of say that at some point, all of you and me were related somewhere. Mujib might have been my mother in some previous life. I may have been the sister to Dominic in some life, and so on, you see. So they say that therefore all sentient beings are like mothers. So I mean, it's assumed that you don't have any mommy issues and your mother is the one you love the most or who has done the most for you. So we refer to them as mother sentient beings. But that is still, you are relying on the understanding of human relationships and so on to try and develop compassion, to remove the other sentient beings' suffering. So in that sense, you could say that, it's at a lower level. Whereas if you say all sentient beings, then that would include everything, animals, earthworms, and all sentient beings in other universes also. But they would all be your mothers, according to the mother sentient being phrase. And of course, you could use it in any way that suits you. I mean, to sort of, so for me, I mean, I sort of feel all the, instead of saying mother sentient beings, for me, it's all my son and daughter sentient beings. It just, what sort of, you're trying to bring a human relationship, which is important to you, to understand compassion for everybody and all sentient beings. So, yeah, and now, of course, I think that what they're saying is, so now the highest is emptiness and the lowest is just suffering and physical, relationships. Then you see somewhere in the middle comes impermanence. So even if you were to say compassion towards other phenomena, then it would be those sort of phenomena when you would be then talking of impermanence. So you would have compassion for a moth which goes into the flame, or we would have compassion for anything that has a consciousness that imagines itself to be permanent, or imagines a relationship to be permanent, or something like that. So I'm not sure which aspect you are referring to, but I do feel I'm confident enough to say that when you are saying compassion, and to understand compassion in terms of emptiness, this is the meaning. Because you remember the earlier example I had given. So there are two roommates. One is awake in the morning, one is still sleeping. And the one who is sleeping is having a nightmare. So in his dream, he's really suffering, really, really suffering. He's imagining he's going to be crushed by a heavy elephant's leg, and he's going to really suffer. So in his sleep, he will scream, he will shout as if he's really in pain. But the roommate who is awake realizes that his roommate is only having a nightmare, that this is only like a dream, this is only an illusion. So to stop that suffering, he has to wake that person up. Because if he wakes the person up, that person will get up and say, oh, that horrible dream, but anyway, it was a dream. There's no elephant here. Nobody's killing me right now. So that would be, the person who is awake has the idea that his experience is an illusion. So the person who is a bodhisattva, who is a Buddha, has the idea that the people who are suffering because of certain essential root ignorance about the nature of reality. That in a sense, this is like a dream. This is like everything is compounded, everything is impermanent, nothing is going to last. So in your dream, you may get a $3 billion lottery. You're very happy. But when you wake up, there is no $3 billion. So whether it's happiness or whether it is suffering, they are all compounded phenomena. If there is no dream, there is no happiness also. So I think that's where, and yeah, so that were two questions, no? I've covered both?
Yeah.
Yeah. So any question arising out of this or any further question, another question?
Aspi, I will ask the same question because I was not there the last time. If
Yeah.
you don't mind repeating in a very quick manner, what on an everyday basis can I do?
Sorry. Yeah.
You know, that will help me with sadhana. So what is sadhana? And what do I do on an everyday basis that I can, at the end of the day, kind of have a little dialogue with myself to say, did I do it or did I fail? So that it helps me along the path.
Yeah. So the first time you asked the question, you had said, what are the skillful means we can use on a day-to-day basis? Because we were talking about skillful means on that day.
Yes.
So, so the thing is, here we are talking about what the Buddha taught, which we could do to help us along this whole existence. So essentially, when people used to come to the Buddha, I'm suffering, I'm doing this, this happened to me, that happened to me. And I want to be a monk, I want to be your student. Then Buddha would say, okay, go and sit under the tree and observe your breath. So Buddha would not be always giving some big discourse because the person is suffering. So when he said, go and sit under the tree and observe your breath, he was simply teaching one method of meditation, which we also tried, you remember. And he has the knowledge and the wisdom, the Buddha has, that if this person observes his mind, his mind will become more focused. Once his mind becomes more focused, then he will see that the mind is like, the thoughts are like waves upon a lake, and so on and so forth. And so he will, and then he will even begin to, with a trained mind, begin to understand what the Buddha might give as a discourse. Now, for us to, okay, you know the other story, which also, so this is one way of skillful means, very directly gives a method of meditation. But then you know the story of Gotami, I think her name was, a lady who lost her young son, like almost a baby child, son. And she goes to the Buddha and says, and she goes around everywhere, meeting all sorts of teachers and wise people and saying, does anybody know a way to bring my son to life? And everybody, of course, says no, it's never been done, we don't know. But, there's one person who seems to be totally enlightened, and you can go and ask him. If anybody can save your son's life or bring him back to life, it would be that person. Nobody else can do it. So she goes to the Buddha. And then the Buddha tells her, of course, we can do it. We can revive your son. He doesn't give her a lecture on impermanence. Everybody has to die one day, and you die at this age or that age because of your nothing of the sort. Of course, he says, we can do it, but you have to do something also. She says, I'll do anything you tell me. He says, okay, go and get me one mustard seed from a house in which there has never been a death. So she, like a village woman, a valuable person, she said, okay, I'll definitely go. I'll go to each and every house in the village, next village, in the town. So she goes from house to house, knocking the door and saying, could you please give me a mustard seed? But my teacher said I should take it from a house where there's been no death. So everybody says, no, then I cannot give. There's no point in giving you, because in my house, my father died, 6 months ago. Somebody says, no, our child died. Somebody says, my grandmother died. So slowly the thing dawns upon her that what she's asking is impossible and against the law of nature. That there is no house, that this, see, Buddha would have told her, he said, that comes to everyone, in every family there is, but he didn't do that. He made her go around and discover for herself that death is there in every family. And so she then realizes why the Buddha told her this. And then she goes and falls at his feet and says, I understand now. What should I do? He says, give your child a decent burial and pray for his good rebirth. And then you can come back to me. So she comes back and becomes, they say, I mean, ultimately she became entirely, totally enlightened. So this is another level of skillful means. Now, when you say, what can I use? Basically, these methods of meditation is what the Buddha primarily meant us to do. But along with that are the 6 parameters which we are studying in Shantideva. So there is generosity, there is patience, there is compassion, there is energetic attitude and behavior, there is meditation, and there is cultivation of wisdom. So all this together are the things we can do in the combination that suits us the best in our present circumstances. So it's not like some very esoteric. Now sadhana, what it means is the sort of a ritualistic approach of prayer and meditation to a deity. So somebody may be given, and that is all done with a teacher. It's never done by reading and on your own, So your teacher would first, even if you go to a teacher who is empowered to give you these sort of sadhanas and practices, many of them coming within Vajrayana and Tantric Buddhism, they will not just give you like that. They will say you have to first do the preparatory practices. What are the preparatory practices? Chant this mantra 1,000,000 times, do this prostration 100,000 times, a lot of physical exercise, ordinary meditation, and if you can survive all that and you are still at the end of it, then he would have known you by then, and then he may say, okay, so it could be, and then again the teacher is likely to know your mind better than what you would prescribe for yourself. Like a doctor, I mean, you could Google and take medicine, or you could go to a doctor and take medicine. Depends how serious your condition is. So then, let's say that you're somebody like me, very intellectual, I mean, or pretentious about his own intellect and so on, and very lazy about sitting on the cushion and meditating for hours and all that, Then now from our account, he says, oh, that gave us Manjushri practice, because Manjushri is the Buddhist of wisdom. But in fact, the teacher might do completely opposite. He might say, no, this fellow is full of intellect, full of reading, full of books. Give him some practice in compassion. Wisdom, he has got enough now. He thinks at least he's got enough. Give him something, and then they may say, no, then you do the sadhana of Avalokiteshvara, who is the Buddha of compassion. I mean, who is supposed to be, Dalai Lama is supposed to be the emanation of. So that is what a sadhana is. It comes much, much later. And it comes when you have a teacher, a proper guru, not a teacher. Like I have so many teachers. I mean, I can say Dalai Lama also is my teacher. Rinpoche is also my teacher. Lakrola is also my teacher. But we are talking about a master-student-disciple relationship, where actually the arrangement and intent is that teacher and you as a student, master and disciple, will from life to lifetime be together through karmic merit, and the master has taken the vow to see you through that till you are enlightened, when he accepts you as a student. We are talking of that master-student relationship, not that, I have so many teachers. But unless you have that commitment between, and so exactly the student has to make that commitment, that he will follow that master to the ends of earth and universe. So that is not what we are talking about. We are talking about first just training our minds so that all these other things you can do. How will you do a sadhana in which you sit against a blank wall, in front of a blank wall, and visualize Manjushri in all his colors and jewels, and if he's Avalokiteshvara with his 1,000 hands and an eye in each hand, in each palm, and so on? If your mind is going to wander within half a minute. So the skillful, but then, and then of course mindfulness is there, the real Buddhist approach to mindfulness. That it's not only the mindfulness you bring to your meditation cushion, or the chanting you do when you're on your cushion, or observing. The whole idea is that your mind is so focused that you can be mindful of what you are going to do before you do it. and not do or say something that makes you then later regret. And of course, if you do something which you later regret, then there is a sort of confession and all that. Again, confession is not asking for forgiveness from anybody because there's nobody there to forgive you. But it is to express your regret, calling upon your teacher or your Buddha, whoever, your deity, to be a witness. Like when you get married and you take marriage vows, you call the guests and you have witnesses. Even in a legal court marriage, in a registered marriage, under the Special Marriages Act, you have to bring 3 witnesses. So the idea is not so much forgiveness for regret, but confessing to yourself that I did something which I should not have done. So that is, I would say, more or less what we are expected or can do. And then you see, you have said, so if you're a Buddhist, if you really say, so people ask always, oh, how do you become a Buddhist? What is it to become what do you do when you want to become a Buddhist? There's nothing much. You're taking that vow or that commitment to go to refuge, to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. You repeat it 3 times, and you commit to lead an ethical life. Now, ethical life in a traditional way, which a traditional Theravada teacher would be to repeat those 5 precepts in Pali after the teacher. I will refrain from killing, from stealing, from lying, from sexual misconduct and substance abuse. I mean, I'm loosely translating. And in fact, there also the actual translation is, I commit to undertake the training to avoid taking life, to avoid sexual misconduct. So you are committing, it's impossible to commit, I will never do this, because you are human and you may fail. But you can definitely commit to give yourself that training and never give up. That aspiration to not kill, and then as much as possible not kill, not abuse, not lie, and so on. So that's all. That makes you a Buddhist. But now, on a day-to-day basis, if you ask, now if you say I've taken refuge in Dharma, what does that mean? That means you will lead your life according to the teachings in that Dharma from the teacher you have taken refuge in, which is in this case the Buddha. I mean, you could even say, no, I take a refuge in Jesus Christ. I commit to lead my life according to the teachings of Jesus and the Bible. And I commit to be in the community, in the church, which is the community of people who accept this commitment to Christ. So there you have it. That's your teacher, your Dharma, and your Sangha. When Jesus says, when 2 or 3 of you meet in my name, that is my church. So when Buddha says, when 2 or 3 of you meet together, that is my Sangha. So that is, so it's not just saying, okay, generosity I will practice, but the mindfulness here, in this sense, is the most important. Because that will keep that commitment to give yourself constantly the training, not just when you're sitting on the cushion. You're sitting on the cushion and peeling an orange, it's like counting your breath. It's just a technique to train your mind. So that, I think, is how one does it.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Any more question?
Just as almost like as an aside, I want to ask you.
Yeah.
If somebody killed Hitler to save the world of a lot of grief, as a Buddhist, how would one see that?
So, we had one session in Bombay once, a whole list of ethical dilemmas, that Sophie's choice sort of thing. And this was one of them. So it's like, it's not just if you, so there are 2 ways you can say, like supposing you were to go in a time machine and Hitler is a baby, would you smother him in his crib only, or if somebody was his nurse when he was a baby and could see into the future and the havoc he has wreaked, would it be right? Should she, in fact, would it be her duty to kill that? Now, I am not sure what is the answer, because there's some sort of trickiness over here. But in a broad sense, definitely the Theravada Buddhists would say no question of killing under any sort of circumstance. And of course, a whole lot of other ethical questions arise. Should you go back in time to change history if it is possible, and so on? But or should one use, supposing that nurse had some omniscience and she knew the future, is it okay to use the omniscience that you have to affect history or affect the future? So the Theravada would definitely say no. In the Mahayana, you have these stories of bodhisattvas. You remember the story of the captain in the ship who overheard these people plotting, and they were going to kill 400 people. So he killed 2 of them and upset their plot and saved the lives of 400 and his own life. Now, it is not that it is right to kill in those circumstances, because the bodhisattva has clearly understood that the law of karma, you see, if he had been tried in a human court of law, that captain would have said, look, it was self-defense. There were extenuating circumstances. I'm not a murderer, and so on and so forth. And the court might possibly, release him also completely, that actually he saved. What if he was a cop? Like a captain is like a cop on a ship. He can do marriages. He can say, look, I am the person in charge of the law here, But the bodhisattva knows that karma is not like that. Karma is it's a law, but it's like the law of gravity. It's not a human law. You cannot plead with the law of gravity. You cannot say, I was a juvenile when I did it. If you throw something from the 10th floor, it's going to go down. It's not going to go up. And that's the law of gravity. So the bodhisattva knows that what he has done is wrong, and that he will have to face the karmic consequences of that. So his argument was, the bodhisattva's argument was, first of all, what will happen? I have killed somebody. Killing somebody merits going to hell. So I will go to hell. I will take my effect, my fruit of my karma. So I will go to hell. But that will delay my enlightenment. I don't know how close I am to how many more lives I have to go and how many more eons I have to do this bodhisattva activity till I become enlightened. But what the hell? I've already taken a vow that I will postpone entry into nirvana. I will not enjoy the fruits of enlightenment till I have taken everybody into enlightenment. So I've already taken that vow. So yes, if I go to hell, it will delay my enlightenment. I have consciously myself taken a vow to delay that. So, okay, so that's the other thing. Then he says, supposing I had not intervened and killed these 2 people, they would have killed 400. What would be the karmic consequences of their act? If for killing 2 people, I have to go to hell for this much period, because in Buddhism, there is no eternal hell. You have to go to, in this next life, I'll go to hell for so many eons, so many years, whatever. Then how much more and how many eons would these ordinary people who have not attained anything, who are not even at my level of bodhisattvahood, how many years would they suffer in hell? So by killing them, I have prevented them from accumulating so much bad karma in so many future lifetimes also, that justifies my killing them. I've actually protected them by killing them. In this life, yeah, they've lost their life in this particular lifetime. But what the hell, what sort of life were they living? They're killing people and robbing people of their assets and everything. So I've stopped that long karmic consequence for them. This is the way the bodhisattva would argue. And not many Mahayana Buddhists would have a quarrel with that. But that doesn't still solve the ethical issue if that situation is posed to you. If you are that nurse in Hitler's nursery and you know the future, it's not so much would it be right to kill or not, because again, we are not talking in terms of good and evil. We are talking in terms of skillful and unskillful. And skillful because you cause suffering, you prevent suffering or create happiness, and unskillful because you are creating suffering. Now, it is left to each one's conscience. But now look at Tibet. Now they were a Mahayana nation, okay? So of course, everybody is aspiring to be Bodhisattva, and of course, many there are mundane things also in those days, but it was a feudal system. The 13th Dalai Lama, the one prior to this one, wanted to raise a standing army because he knew what was happening. Not many people know that just as this Dalai Lama came away to India in 1959, the previous Dalai Lama also escaped from Tibet and came, I think, to Nepal, or even he came to India. But then that time the Chinese efforts to take over Lhasa didn't succeed. And the British had intervened a little bit here and there with their mischief. So the Dalai Lama, 13th one, could go back. So he had also come to exile. And the 13th Dalai Lama after that realized that this is not going to work. Tibet will be destroyed. And if Tibet as a nation is destroyed, then the chances of Buddhism surviving and all that were, of course, difficult. So he wanted to raise a standing army. Now, of course, if you raise a standing army, that means you're going to oppose any invasion, you're going to oppose any aggression, in which case there will be a war, at least there'll be a skirmish, and people will die. And you raise an army to train them to kill the enemy. You're not raising them to treat them like mother sentient beings after that. But his own monks, his senior monks, so opposed him that he didn't have the political power to create that army. And then when the Chinese actually started in 49, Tibet did collapse and there was nobody to fight. And those who put up some armed resistance, in 2 days they surrendered and stood in line. You've seen those videos, and offered their rifles to the Chinese soldiers. So in spite of all this, where they could have all argued, no, we are bodhisattvas, we are saving Tibetan Buddhism by killing Chinese soldiers, but the monks were against it. Now again, till now there is a controversy where many young people say this was a total mistake. Dalai Lama should have made alliances with the foreign powers. At that time in 49, US and England and everybody would have been happy. But they were waiting for India to take the lead. Unless India gives them some basis, how are they going to get into Tibet? And India refused, Nehru refused. So, because he had the dream that the next century is Asia's, with China and India coming together. And well, China and India are still at Ladakh trying to come together. So what I'm trying to say is that intellectually these arguments sound fantastic, but in practice you may not be able to do it. Just out of your own conscience. The monks, I don't think, were in cahoots with the Chinese or trying to get, and they would get nothing. They would all be destroyed and tortured. And that's what happened later. All of them were killed and murdered. But they refused to take the violent course. So I don't know. It doesn't answer your question, Siddharth, but it gives us all some food for thought, I suppose.
I had a related question. I was just wondering, since you mentioned that if we had omniscience, then perhaps we would be able to see into the future and see the consequences of certain actions. So if we were to believe the historic facts, we don't know to what extent they're true, but speaking of historic Buddha, he is believed to have that omniscience. He could see things. Yeah. But if we look at some of the things that happened during his time, for example, when his own people, the Sakya people, came to him asking what could be the way in which we could defeat the People's Republic, who were very strong people, Buddha, I don't know, but probably had a chance to prevent that war. But he still gave them the advice saying, basically telling them what were the strengths of a People's Republic, which will make them invincible. So, which gave clue to his own people what were the way in which they could win over these people, which was basically to divide them, pretty much what the governments are doing in these days, that a community which is united will be invincible. And as long as they remain united, you will not be able to defeat them. This is the kind of advice he gives them. So I was wondering then, someone like him who was supposed to be enlightened, had the omniscience, had the power to, if he had the power to prevent war, which subsequently happened and the People's Republic is supposed to have been defeated, he did not exercise that choice. So I have often been confused about this. I mean, whenever we talk about what should be the action, I've often been confused about these historic facts as to why Buddha did not intervene. Why did he say that there should be no wars? Because there were so many wars during his time. many led by his own people.
So first thing to clarify is that the Buddha had omniscience, but he's not omnipotent like God. He cannot do all this just because he wants it, or even if he can see into the future. If he was omnipotent, the first thing he would have done is to ensure that everybody becomes enlightened very quickly. So it would be so easy, you take refuge in the Buddha, and he can sort of observe your behavior like a school teacher or school principal. Acha, this guy is good, probation period ho gaya, give him enlightenment. He can't do that. He said very clearly, I cannot give you enlightenment. Now, omniscience definitely doesn't mean determinism, that everything is determined, because there is a question of human free will. I mean, this is a big thing, free will and determinism. Bertrand Russell and all have written volumes on this. So are we in a deterministic universe, or are we in a universe where free will also plays a role? So let's say that I am omniscient and you have a free will. You keep jumping. I don't know how that happens in Zoom. Where is Nima has come here? Okay. So what happens is, so supposing I am omniscient and we are going to have a session next Friday. Now you have a complete free will to come for that session, just go to sleep or attend that other meeting, which is also important. Omniscient only means I know in advance what your choice will be. I know in advance what your choice will be, but it will be your choice. I am not omnipotent to say, or any sort of power over you, to say, no, I will see to it that she doesn't go for that meeting and attends this one. So this is the slight difference. Now, Buddha would have been against war. From a common understanding point of view, again, the same thing like Dalai Lama was against war, and so many Tibetan monks were against fighting the Chinese. It could simply be that war creates suffering, and war is no solution to any problem. But it could also be, if you say he was omniscient, then why he didn't interfere? Why did he not allow them to go to war if wars are so common? But wars are common, and he knows from his wisdom that wars create suffering. That the problem was over water supply and river water, the two kingdoms of fighting. So maybe his omniscience could see how much more suffering there would be in both kingdoms if they went to war. And it came to a point where the council, that it's a republic, so it's not like his father is the king and what the king says goes. He's an elected king or he's an elected leader. I mean, loosely we say Siddharth, Prince Siddharth, but he was prince, means he was the son of a leader who had been elected by the republic. So they actually said, if you do not allow us to go to war, we will remove your father as the leader, and we might even confiscate all your assets as a state. So all this was going on. So it is not as simple as he was enlightened, so he could have done. And actually, I'm sorry, but I don't think he was enlightened when this war thing proposal came up. Because you see, if you read Dr. Ambedkar's Buddha and his Dharma, which on historical fact I don't think is very accurate, and his main source has been D.D. Kosambi. The reason why the Ambedkarites believe the Buddha left the palace was not because he saw those four sights, that he saw death and illness and old age and a renunciant over there. He apparently, they say, left the palace because he did not want this war, and he and his father would have lost the leadership if he had insisted. So rather than insisting that his will should prevail, he walked away from the palace. Now, that to me doesn't seem very convincing, because in the end there was no war. If he walked away because he didn't want to be part of the war, once he walks away, there should have been a war. Those people were free to do what they wanted. And then he walks away, and for what reason? Then what is the whole, the whole story doesn't gel together. So that's the other thing. He wasn't enlightened at that point. Now, if you take the Lotus Sutra view, the Mahayana view, that is always the Buddha, that this is not the historical Buddha. He was actually, enlightened throughout. That means even when he was a prince and before he renounced the palace, he was already enlightened. Then even then, we could say that his omniscience may have foreseen the problem that war would have created. And they finally did solve the problem peacefully. So his view was found to be correct in the end. So that's his omniscience. That if I do this, if I do that, then if I insist and not allow them to go to war, we will prevail and the solution will be found in a peaceful way. Nima, I think you missed some of it, but I think it's being recorded, so you'll have to catch up. So, more questions?
Okay, I had a question that is linked to what you were answering Bindu's question, which is about the fact, like, you know, how do we...
Can you hear me, Aspi?
Yes. Why? I can hear you. I can hear her also.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, did you lose the Zoom connection?
No, no, no. Everything is going fine.
I can't hear you, Aspi.
Others can hear me.
No, MR is now host. When you your line went off, automatically it goes to the next person. So it's gone to MR now. MR can pass it back to you if you want. But there was no break in connection.
Did you lose the Zoom connection? Did you lose the Zoom connection?
John, I don't think Siddharth can hear anybody.
No, I can hear you now.
Message. Just send him a chat message.
Don't worry, you don't get disconnected now, even if the host goes off.
Ah, okay, because I lost
they have sorted out. Yeah, they have sorted
out.
out.
I lost my power just now. Yeah.
No, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Annie, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to understand what would be your perspective, Aspi, since you're the most experienced here with Buddhism, on how does one balance this dilemma about being too compassionate versus, you know, because I mean, in the world we live in, especially like in the context we live in, there's so much of suffering, and you see, so, and there is always something you can do, right? Whether it's someone you see on the street or, you know, like larger causes like, you know, climate change or whatever. So how do you balance that? Because, I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, you have to be compassionate, and I know you have to balance it with wisdom. But then how do you understand this boundary of when you have to stop or when you should stop? Is it when you get exasperated, or, you know, how does one make those calls?
The various, now see, for instance, it's difficult to answer in general, but because it could depend on the merit of each case, each person's capability. But we all know, as those of us who have been activists for so many years, and we know of our companions who are also activists along with us and who are no longer activists because they have burnt out. Many have burnt out. Enough is enough, they say, you know. Now, one way, first, you see, it's not the problem so much of balancing. I think it's more a problem of burnout. How much compassion are you going to keep giving? How much are you going to keep fighting at people who are destroying everything around you?
Yes.
So the danger is not so much that you may not balance. What will happen if you don't balance? You'll be more compassionate and less whatever practical, worldly, or you'll be more practical and world-wise and you're a little less compassion somewhere else. The problem is that this seesaw is what burns us out. So again, the answer to Bindu is also the answer to your question, in that your practice and your value systems and all, you should have that much confidence, and your practice should be like recharging your phone every night. So there is a sort of, you know, your phone also will die out if you, however good your battery is. Some will claim 48 hours, some will claim 7 days, ultimately if you don't charge it. So that is the problem, one of burnout. Second is, the danger is, you know, if you are too much of an, you know, mind-only person, like mind, I'm not using the Buddhist mind only, I'm saying mind-focused person, then you may develop an attitude that, I understand what is happening. I know why the government of India is doing this. What are the causes and conditions? Of course, there is no inherent, there is no Modi, there is no. You can go on intellectualizing like this and lose the grip on compassion on that aspect completely.
Yeah.
And but that would mean, at least you are reading, you're doing something. You may not be meditating, but you're reading and you're convincing yourself intellectually. But the other one is often more common, where you are just overwhelmed by the suffering and you just want to give. And of course, there's a limit to what you can materially give, because you don't even have beyond a certain point. But then you keep giving of your personality, of your emotional energy, of yourself so much. And anybody can catch you and say, hey, you got 2 minutes, I have to tell you this, and you have a long sob story for 2 hours. So that also is another danger. So that we call idiot compassion. Compassion without total, anybody can take you for a ride, You don't just, somebody comes and tells you, I'm in this position, give me this much money. You'll keep giving and you'll keep getting cheated, but you'll keep thinking, oh, this is compassion. So that is idiot compassion. So the balance really depends on your mindfulness, and not just trusting anybody blindly, but not coming to a position where you distrust everybody the first time you meet them, because everybody cheated me, everybody is a crook, I'm not going to believe anybody. So all these things go on. So I don't think there's a general answer, but the general answer could only be that if you keep your mind focused, train that mind to focus on problems, to, not burn out by over being. So look at the Bodhisattva says, I'll save everybody. Now,
Yeah.
here we are worried about our little surroundings where you see so much suffering. Imagine taking on a task every sentient being in every universe in this cosmos, and taking on that task. How much faster would they burn out? How long are they going to last if they really start giving things to each and every sentient being? So it's not so much, again, like renunciation. It's also an attitude. An aspiration to do that will give you the energy to not burn out and to do what you are calling the balancing. Now, from another point of view, I had a sort of a similar problem, not in this balancing business, but balancing something else. So when I was the first few years of Buddhism, where my profession as such was a freelance computer guy, programming and training people and so on, and setting up internet and, networks and so on. Now, if you are going to be good in that profession, you need to be all the time reading, the latest developments in computer science from magazines, from the internet and so on. And my interest was more and more towards Buddhism. So like, I want to read Buddhist books. I don't want to read some, PC magazine or something like that. So that was the thing I was trying to balance. And then I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and when I put him this problem, then he said, look, your problem is you are trying to balance these two things, your profession and your interest in Buddhism, on a day-to-day basis. You can't do this on a day-to-day basis. You can't say, today I will read Buddhism, tomorrow I will read computer. You can't do that. He said, told me, you plan your year. You plan your year in such a way that you consciously keep aside 15 days, 1 month, where you'll put aside your money making and your profession and everything. Money making means what your income sort of activity, and just do Buddhism, go on a retreat, arrange in advance that in February and March, I will do this. And then when you come back energized, take up your professional work, and then don't worry too much about, just do your whatever practice you want to do every day, half an hour, 1 hour, whatever. Don't worry about spreading Buddhism, teaching Buddhism, all that. You just don't worry about that. You balance it that way. Now, this is also one solution, no? If you say that, now I'm an activist, but I also need to, I would do this job because otherwise I'll starve. If activism is not going to, nobody's going to pay me for that activism. Then this is the same sort of thing, no? Then you can say, okay, these are the issues I'll concentrate on. I cannot jump into every issue. I cannot go for every procession and morcha. I'm not going to sign every petition that comes on the Facebook. I will study the issue I am interested in, and I will support those people. So that's another way. I don't know. I don't really any hard and fast answer you can have. But I think it depends a lot on us, our mindfulness, and, the Then again, for instance, John knows, and I think Siddharth may know, we were working in the villages. We went to work in 1973 in Maharashtra, Ahmednagar district. In 75, the emergency was declared. Now, when we went to work in the villages, we just worked for a Christian organization because there was a famine that time and there was a lot of starvation. Nafiza was there, Dominic was there. And they gave us the job of organizing the local people and distributing milk powder for children and some food for work program, distributing maize and corn that used to come from America for people, locals who were given job of building a road or constructing a bund or something like that. Now, so we went into that area just to do this sort of charity work, you can say. We were, of course, our dream was we'll do development work. But then our ideas of charity and development changed completely when we saw the caste structure and the class structure in the village. But when the emergency was declared in 75, we had come to a point where we are doing literacy classes and fighting for minimum wages. And we even did a very premature strike in a sugar factory that was being built. I mean, you don't mess with sugar factories in Maharashtra, you know. And we were nothing, we were just out of college. So when the emergency came, we were told, now you either go home or you go to jail. And we decided to go home. We said we'll continue the work somewhere else. So it would have been rather unwise and foolish to have said, no, we'll go to jail. Jail for what? What principle? We had not even developed any principles. We were just becoming politically aware, thinking of ourselves as Marxists or leftists, just getting to know some basic reading, you know. And so it was, I think, a wise thing. And that time, nobody knew that the emergency will go away in 2 years. That time we were all, okay, now finished. Now like next 30 years, there's fascism. So we decided, what's the point of fighting with these people here? Who are they? How important are they? If we want to do a political approach to development, well, the whole country is there. And let us be clear about our own ideas first, before we just jump into something and say, go to jail, go to jail. What we are, it's not a freedom struggle, it's nothing, you know. So that's what I'm saying. It has to be your own sort of little thinking also. And, you know, ego shouldn't come too much into it.
Thank you, Aspi.
Haspi, can you expand on that? You ended with ego shouldn't come on that.
Yeah, if we had sort of said that time, yeah, let's go to jail. You know, after all, Nehru went to jail, Gandhi went to jail. And that would be ego, no? What purpose would it have achieved? Who knew about us? Would the villagers have come also in a small morsha to say, no, release these people? They would all go to jail then. So that's what I mean. If you cannot take decisions on the basis of, you know, ego that way. But on the other hand, one of our guys who was actually the most sort of sincere worker, etc., he was accused of rape or attempted rape or some crap like that. This was the time when the landlords were against us because of the strike and the literacy classes and all. So that time, the girl who was, they said is the victim, she came and told the police, no, this is a completely fraudulent case. And her father was part of that whole sarpanch and, you know, ruling class gang over there. And moreover, the area we were working in was a Congress area, which means, I mean, they were all supportive of the emergency. So just, you know, that's what I mean, you know, sometimes we take decisions which are just, we don't want to admit we made a mistake, or we don't want to admit that there can be another way to do the same thing. I mean, I think John is also experiencing that right now in the activism. Aisa karega. But dhire se, you know, I mean, like, what are you against? Who is your real enemy? You know, many groups cannot work together today because they have ideological purity questions.
The main issue among a whole range of activists is that quite a lot of whatever they have done is external to them. The processes that have to take place with the self and the way in which one relates to whatever one wants to do, that has not really taken place. And many of them therefore are looking at things like Buddhism and like even here among us, this group, like in the Vikarp Sangam, who is also part of this whole thing. The whole question of what is the process work that we do with ourselves, and then our relationship with the community and it is that search that I feel that has brought many people into Buddhism instead of, say, other. Because ideological kind of thing is not sufficient to take decisions like these. Because there seems to be totally external circumstances, objectivity, the revolution has to take place, this, that. And now that the revolution is not going to come tomorrow, then we won't do. So these are some of the issues that are there. But the main reason why we perhaps left, because we were in a sense powerless, so we had not even thought of it, what we should do. We didn't have an ideological position, and so therefore, yeah, we just knew that okay, we had to make noise and those kind of things. But it's only after we came back that we started thinking much larger about the other issues. Maybe Dominic would like to come in because he's got a lot to say about it. And basically, there is that search that is there now among quite a lot of people for finding this whole issue of how do you make peace with yourself? How do you feel non-violent in a circumstance like this? Like the amount of anger that we have on the system is so much. It's so difficult to not be angry, not be violent, not be violent. And even though on the surface we've said no, violence will beget only more violence, at some level we still feel, "Arey yaar, Modi ko maar do, nahi to isko maar do, wo maar." Then how do you cope with it? You know, that is some of the issues that we are grappling with, both collectively and as well as individually. For me, the violence question is actually the main.
No, so I think, John, you mentioned one important point which comes to me. So the point is that burnout thing which I mentioned. So yes, you get angry. Now what the Dalai Lama says, what all Buddhist teachers say is okay to get angry, but your anger should not lead to or be driven by hatred. Anger will not burn you out, but hatred will burn you out. You see the difference. A mother can get angry with her 3-year-old child also because she loves the child. She's motivated by, so the child is doing something totally stupid. I don't know whether I gave this example in the past. Playing with the gas cylinder, trying to light the gas from the adapter, whatever it's called, adapter. And obviously the mother is going to panic and take away and say, don't ever go near that cylinder. And if the child repeatedly does that, the mother gives it such a tight whack that pain the child remembers and will not go to the gas cylinder. Obviously the mother is angry. Without anger, the energy to raise your hand and hit the child will not come. But is she doing it out of hatred? She hates the child for doing that? No. She knows the child is ignorant and she loves the child. So the anger is driven by love and effect that her anger and her action will have in future for the benefit of the child. Now many child like, so no, under no circumstances you should lift your hand. But these are practical things and it happens. Dalai Lama says, I was caned, my teachers used to cane me if I didn't give the right answer. Now, but he said, now I'm better for that. So I mean, it's like that. So hatred will of course consume you, because then you, as John says, on the one hand you're full of hate, on the other hand you're totally powerless. You can't really do anything against these guys. You can't do anything against the local cop who will come and try to beat you with a lathi because he thinks you have violated some lockdown rule. So when you're that powerless and that full of hate, then all these things happen. Hello, who's that?
SP,
Yep.
Many of us who are concerned with, let's say, the climate crisis and worried about the future, probably less our future for those of us who are old and may not live to see the worst of it, but let's say younger people, and filled with anxiety and perhaps even a sense of hopelessness. I was wondering how, from a Buddhist perspective, one would deal with it.
Wish I knew. The only thing is, yeah. See what Dalai Lama says about anxiety. No, I'm saying it. I'm only repeating his words. I cannot do it myself. Is if there's something you can do about the problem, do it. If there's nothing you can do about a problem, why worry and be anxious? But then we all, I get anxious every other time, every other occasion, 10 times a day, I'm anxious about this and that, especially about children, your own children, and what you're seeing around you, and the cruelty to people who are less fortunate, the total cruelty from the state. So, but the point is, he's right. Can you do anything about it? What are you so anxious about? You can't do anything. And if you can do, bloody well go ahead and do something. But I think that sometimes speaking up helps. Speaking up, just speaking up, like who was that phrase said, your tongue is still your own. But there also you have to be careful, like we have one WhatsApp group, where there are some bugs and there are some anti-bugs like me. So now I say certain things there. And this guy says, oh, if you really have the guts, why don't you put it on Facebook? Now he's playing with my ego, I say, yeah, I'll put it on Facebook. Yeah, next day I'll get arrested. I am such a fool or what? What do you think me to be? I'm saying this to you to make you aware. And you people, you bugs in our group to be aware of this. I'm not going to go to jail to change Mark Zuckerberg's viewpoint of Modi. You see, that's what I'm saying. So here also you have to be careful, but you have to speak up. At some point you have to speak up. At least that gives you, because it may trigger something in somebody else,
I also think another thing helps is, instead of thinking of it as one overarching, very large, nebulous problem, like finding a small place of action in your own lives, and then, celebrating it, and not just feeling deepness se kya hota hai and all that. So not minimizing the few things that we do, in that sense.
Yeah, when it comes to action, but then you see, you have to sort of think globally also. You act locally, as you're saying, but you have to think globally, because unless you have the big picture, you finally, in the long run, you can't defend yourself. Like all the NTCA protests, see what these kids are going through now, for supporting those protests. Now, you would say, oh, that's a very local thing. Okay, they were only supporting the protests in their street. But suddenly, the whole thing has been turned by the state into, oh, it was all anti-national and a conspiracy and planned in advance, So we need also to keep the big picture while doing these local things. Why, remember, you had not joined that time. You come first time today. We were talking about the protests in Bombay, no? When Delhi, there was so much violence. And I said in Bombay, there was hardly, people were peaceful and they gave biscuits and water to the cops who had been on duty from the morning. And that was probably because there was some mature leadership in some groups here in Bombay. I mean, here I'm thinking of myself in Bombay. Then maybe in Delhi, the passions were really very high. I don't know, some context I had given that example in the first 1 or 2 sessions, no? Yeah, because so for instance, if something has happened in Delhi and then you are doing a protest in Bombay, you don't want to take the attitude, let's provoke the cops, then they will do lathi charge, then the TV stations, all the channels will show the brutality of the cops. That's not the aim. When I say larger picture, what is the aim of the protest? Not to teach people about police brutality. If that was the case, okay, go ahead and do all that. You want to make people aware about the dangers of CAA. You want them to become aware of what this whole conspiracy from the state is. So you want peace in that rally. You don't want violence. You don't want to invite a lathi charge. You want peace so that your good speakers can make those speeches, and those speeches go on television, and people are convinced more and more that what the state is doing is wrong. And this is not in the welfare of anybody in this country. So the whole thing, if you go again by ego and hatred and, police, fascist pigs, then you're going to screw up your own ultimate aim.
Asneet, could I ask a slightly related question? This is
Sure.
I was wondering from the Buddhist perspective, given the situations like what we are facing, political or environmental, in addition to all the activism, and in certain times like now, probably less aggressive activism because of whatever the political situation, what role does aspiration and visualization techniques that Buddhists talk about play?
What role does, what are the two things you said? The role which?
Aspirational prayer
Aspirational
and visualization of a world as we would like to see it, because they also talk about these as two positive ways in which you could bring about a sublime change, if not bring about a direct change.
subtle change, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, subtle change. Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds a little new agey. I'm not sure. Aspirational and visualization. I mean, in the sense that we are talking of the emphasis of thought leading to change in external circumstances. I mean, like you become what you think, that sort of thing. And so if all of society thinks, then society becomes like what you think. Is that something like what you have in mind? I mean, is
Yes,
that,
because
yeah.
some of the meditations are also related to that. Like when we are talking about having bodhicitta for, say, someone like Modi and Shah, you're in some ways aspiring for to bring about a change within them, knowing that they may not be in your living time. And similarly, some of the visualizing meditations are in that if kind of leading you to visualize a more positive change rather than constantly dwelling into the negativity while continuing to fight, while continuing to resist and struggle, but try and visualize a more positive outcome.
I think it would help. So, this is a bit like the question when we were studying that loving kindness meditation. And the question which arose was that when you are sending loving kindness to the person who is your adversary, will it be just of benefit to you yourself, in that you will become calmer with that person, or you are developing kindness and so on? Or will your relationship in the actual world also change? Okay, you follow what I'm saying, no? In the loving kindness meditation. Huh, Nima? You
Yes,
can hear me?
yes, yes,
Huh?
yes, yes.
So now some teachers say, no, this is mind training for yourself. Don't expect things to change, that your relationship actually will improve with your enemy or your rival or your adversary. Whereas some definitely feel, no, of course it will have an effect, simply because we all have Buddha nature and we are all interconnected. We are all each other's causes and conditions. So therefore, if you are, as you say, aspirational and you visualize a better world, or at least a better relationship with some particular person or group, that will actually have an effect in the outside world. And I tend to agree with that. Though I don't know if there is any particular Buddhist meditation, just as we have loving kindness, where you visualize all these people and then you send them loving kindness, whether there is something corresponding where you visualize sort of peace on earth and goodwill to men sort of thing, and you do a proper systematic meditation and visualization on that. I have not come across any such meditation procedure, like a proper thing. Like in loving kindness, we have, 5 stages, first this, second that, and so on. Similarly, with observing the breath, counting the breath, and observing your bodily feelings and sensations. I have not come across this, but it's a good idea to investigate. But
What about,
that's why my first thing was new agey, because there are some methods being tried to be developed in these various new age groups. You know what I mean by new age, no? Sort of, using crystals and this and that, and sort
yeah,
of, we are all one sort of philosophy, which Buddhism doesn't accept. We are not all one, we are
but
all connected.
what I was thinking more in terms of, say, the meditation of Buddha Amitabha, where you visualize everyone to be in this perfect world.
Yes, that can be done. That because you're then visualizing everybody who is suffering being in the pure land, isn't it? Isn't that what you're saying?
Yes.
And certainly it would have an effect on yourself. Visualizing everybody, I mean, visualizing a better world, which is your heart's longing, would certainly have an effect on you in reducing that anger and hatred and so on. And in understanding at least other people's motives and wickedness and so on. I think that definitely would help.
Because I was just thinking also in more practical sense, where there is so much hopelessness around us, something like a Vikalp Sangam or a Vikalp Varta or a thought of an alternative, well-being, peace and justice attracts a lot of people. And more young people find themselves joining this whole idea that there is an alternative possible. So if it is, so from that point of view, I was saying that if it can happen in more material world, can it also happen in dealing with stress, anxiety in our internal world?
I think there's more chance of it happening in the internal world than in the outer world. Because see, when I'll tell you what struck me at the moment you said, more and more young people are joining Vikalp Sangam and so on, alternative things. There will still be some diehard cynics, and maybe I'm one of those closet ones, who will say, come on, grow up. Who's going to promote all these alternatives? You have this whole capitalist corporate industrial class who is bent on suppressing all alternatives. We would have had alternatives long ago. Appropriate technology we were talking about in the 70s. What has happened? Where is it all gone? Government is facilitating. Look at the EIA. Look at the environmental regulations they are now bringing in. You can set up what you want. After that, we will see about permission and feasibility and so on. So what I'm saying is it is more difficult in the material world than in your internal world, I feel. You get what I'm saying, Some people will say, Arey, what are you talking? What alternative? Look at the class structure. Look at how industry, how media, how everybody is in one huge, exercise of manufacturing consent for neoliberalism and capitalism. And you are going to fight that. It's like when we were in the villages, we understood everything, class struggle, but who are we? We are 12 college kids. And do we have the power to take on these people? Internally, you can have the aspiration. That is easier, I feel, but of course, it has to start internally and go outward also. I'm not trying to be discouraging about Vikalp Sangam, because what that is needed to convince people what is wrong with the present system, and we have to change that. But I'm not sure whether...
Yeah, I look at the visualization thing slightly differently. When I was ill and I got into meditation and visualization quite heavily. I realized that the visualization was also helping me to come to terms with the physical realities of different parts of my body by that visualization. And that I had to do something about it. I had to keep taking my medicine, so I had to do my breathing, I had to kind of, do various things that I had to reduce my food, I had to kind of, oil, vegetarianism, this, that. And then you can see slowly your visualization becomes actual. There is a relationship. Similarly, I think in collective, one is that I think there is what you had given this whole thing about simultaneous karma, benefits of an action. You get for yourself simultaneously when you do. Yeah. But when it is with the other, there is a need for a joint with the other. Some other conditions, causes and conditions have to be created. And you realize that, and therefore you go about making those causes and conditions, creating those conditions and causes. And that is why I feel that quite a lot, even in the Vikalp syndrome, the idea that, okay, each one is doing their own thing and we are coming, we are feeling good. But the realization that we have got to make those causes little more interconnected and a little more, go further. Your contemplation has to take us a little further. The processes that we are doing with ourselves in the Vikalp syndrome has got to take that further, and we have got to then do that part little more. Just each one doing their thing and whatever will not do. So you visualize that, you come to that, to share it. And therefore, then a collective then starts visualizing this kind of thing. And therefore, we then think of all the problems, the issues, and then you know, 15 people can't form a revolution, but at least we can form a group which does that. Then you see the next step, then you visualize the next step. So this aspiration is to go towards the other one, but the visualization actually puts you in that particular thing and you go deeper into it. And therefore you have to bring the others into it. You can't just say, okay, I am contemplating, my job is over, that person has to do it. No. No, part of the thing is if it's a community thing, then the community has to also come. So you do things that are necessary for that.
Because that's why, you know, very often everybody says, you know, and they experience this, that when you do meditation in a group, even if you're steadied, you know, watching the breath or loving kindness, but when you do it in a group, it has a very different effect individually and on the group as if you're sitting at home and doing it alone. That is absolutely correct and acceptable.